Hello and welcome to the lecture on evolution for Anthropology 105. Evolution in itself is a pretty easy concept to understand. We just have a lot of baggage attached to this term culturally, so today we're going to go through and what we mean by evolution, and more importantly, what are the forces of evolution. So evolution is just simply change in a population over time. That's it. Evolution can be cultural. We can look at the population of compasses in the world and we can see that the populations of compasses have changed over time. This is an ancient Chinese compass. It's just a polished spoon on a polished surface that aligns with magnetic fields of the Earth. We can also look at changes in physical populations over time. So all evolution means is change in a population over time. So we can see this physically in the population of whales. This is Ambulocetus, an ancient, now extinct quadruped that gave rise to whale populations. And if we look at whale populations back through time, we can see characteristics of these populations changing. We can also see cultural evolution in the population of iPods. Over time, the population of iPods that people use have certainly changed as new characteristics have been acquired. So there's four things that you need to know about evolution to start to dispel a lot of this cultural baggage that goes along with this term. And I'll go through each of these points individually. So first of all, the pace varies. This is brain size over time in millions of years. So as you move from left to right, we see that brain size has increased. And for a long time, we see a stasis in brain size, and then we see for a certain period of time a gradual change in brain size, then a quick punctuated increase in brain size, and then stasis again. And this represents the fact that the pace of evolution can vary. It depends on pressures in the landscape. So for example, our chimp-like ancestor 5 to 7 million years ago was, as far as we know, quite similar to modern-day populations of chimpanzees. So they've experienced, in many characteristics, a very gradual evolution, a very gradual change in chimpanzee or chimpanzee-like populations over time. Humans, however, have experienced a very rapid evolution. We've seen rapid changes in brain size, rapid changes in aspects of bipedality, rapid changes in our cooperative abilities. So the pace can vary. The direction also varies. So those changes in brain size that I was showing you are very similar to this increase of human brain size over the last million years, or the brain size of our ancestors. However, male bonobo brain size has actually shrunk over the last 4 million years. It's gotten smaller. Does this mean that bonobos are less evolved than we are? No, they have experienced change over time as well. Just the change has occurred in a different direction. We've had other aspects like our appendix shrink in size over time. So the direction of change can vary. And there's no value judgment on the direction that's occurring. So I don't want you to be thinking that evolution is linear. It's not linear. Oftentimes evolution is occurring in multiple different directions between multiple different populations at the same time. So this is the old view of evolution as linear, and the new view as branching, as different changes are occurring in different directions. A third property that you need to understand is that a major cause is environmental change. A major cause of change in a population is due to pressures in the environment. So we think that 3 to 4 million years ago, or possibly going back further, there was a change in the environment. Climate changed, the rainforest in Africa cooled and dried. There was a reduction in the amount of forest. This means that apes can't get between trees or patches of trees by climbing anymore. They have to get down on the ground and walk. And this change in the climate might have been the environmental pressure that led to bipedality in our ancestors. So whenever we think about evolutionary change, changes in populations, one of the first things that we look at is changes in the environment. The fourth point is that similarities can happen in two ways, and these are similarities between physiology and behavior. So we can look at two populations and say that they're similar due to a shared evolutionary history. So you and your cousin might have the same hair color due to a shared family history. However, you might have the same hair color as someone that you're not related to, and they might have inherited the same gene as you did. Different groups can have similar solutions to different problems, and this is known as homoplasy. I'm going to show you two examples. So homology, similar adaptations through a shared ancestry. We see this in the history of male group territory fission fusion. So chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans all have territory groups based on males fissioning and fusing. Gorillas and orangutans have a different social structure. And possibly one explanation is that chimpanzees and bonobos and humans have a shared evolutionary history, a shared ancestry. Homoplasy means adaptations for shared problems. So termites are a problem. They're a delicious food that live inside trees and other inaccessible places. And we see two independent adaptations for tool use occurring. So we see tool use evolving in crow populations. They know how to take sticks and put them inside trees where termites live. The termites see the fresh wood, they bite onto the stick, the crows pull out the stick and pick the termites off. Chimpanzees have also independently evolved fishing for termites with twigs. They'll put the twig in, termites bite it, pull it out, and there you go, tasty snack. This is homoplasy because it's a shared problem that two entirely independent populations have independently evolved solutions to. So let's look at some forces of evolution. What would cause changes in populations to occur over time? First of all, we have mutation. Mutations are changes to a DNA sequence. These can be passed on to offspring if a mutation occurs in a cell on the path to be changed into a gamete. So you can only pass on mutations through eggs and sperm. If a mutation happens in a skin cell during the course of your life, that won't be passed on to offspring. But if in the gamete line, the sex cell line, there is a mutation that occurs, that can be passed on to offspring. Mutations are pretty uncommon, and they're usually harmful or sometimes neutral, which means neither harmful nor beneficial. So usually mutations are harmful. A change in the DNA sequence causes an individual to not grow arms or be more susceptible to cancer or something like that. So mutations can cause changes in populations over time as they change the characteristics of individuals in those populations. This is a fairly straightforward one to understand. The most difficult concept to understand is natural selection as a force of evolution. So we're going to slow down a bit here and talk more about natural selection because this is a really important concept for the class. So here's my little mini lecture on natural selection, or why the world isn't full of bunnies. So there used to be this commercial on TV where an old man and his granddaughter go into a pet shop to buy a rabbit, or two rabbits. And because it takes them so long to write a check, the rabbits just keep mating and mating and mating, and eventually they're up to their ears in bunnies in this pet shop. Why isn't that the case in the world? So let's just start with one rabbit. Let's imagine every rabbit doubles every generation. So after one generation, we've got 2 rabbits, 4 rabbits, 8 rabbits, 16 rabbits, 32 rabbits. In just 20 generations, and rabbits can reproduce fairly quickly, we would have over 1 million bunnies, and in just 100 generations, we would have, I don't even know what number this is, bunnies. That's a lot of bunnies. So why isn't the world full of bunnies? And the answer is that resources like food and water and space are finite. So that means that there is competition for available food, water, space in the population. And if there is variation in phenotype, phenotype means observable characteristics of an individual. If there's variation in the characteristics of individuals in a population, that means that some bunnies will have traits that allow them to survive and reproduce get access to food, get access to water, get access to space, more often than bunnies without those traits. So because bunnies vary in their ability to compete for resources, some will survive, some will find mates, some will have offspring, and some won't. And some of that variation is heritable. So if the more successful bunnies pass on their successful traits to their kids, the kids will also be more successful. And this means that over time, the more successful bunnies will outcompete those bunnies without the advantageous traits. So over time, we will see a change in the population because some bunnies inherit characteristics that make them more competitive for the limited resources. Let's look at another example. Here's some organisms living in an environment. There's always more organisms produced than can survive. And you can see in these offspring here, there's a variation in phenotypes, a variation in these characteristics that are inherited from their parents. So there's two medium-sized parents. There's a variety of genes that control for height. Some of their offspring got the tall genes, some of their offspring got the short genes, some got a mix. And some of the organisms have a phenotype more suited to their environment than others. So in this case, the offspring that got the tall genes are more suited to an environment with food hanging from the ceiling. These organisms with favorable phenotypes, favorable characteristics, are more likely to survive and reproduce. So over time, the population will be filled with those phenotypes. So in this case, because only the tall offspring survive and reproduce, they will pass on their tall genes. All of those offspring that only got short genes won't survive, won't reproduce, and won't get a chance to pass on their genes. And this process produces what we call adaptations. Adaptations are changes in the physical structure, function, or behavior of an organism that promote survival and promote reproduction in a given environment. So this image is showing you all the different adaptations of killer whales that promote their survival and promote their reproduction. So in this case, it's ability to find food, and in many instances, your ability to find food affects your ability to reproduce as well. So let's just go back for 1 second. We'll go through these points really quickly again. There we go. You can imagine in a different environment, if all of the food was growing on the ground, we would see a different set of adaptations evolving. It goes back to the idea that environmental change is a major cause of evolution by natural selection. So this seems pretty simple, but the question I often get from students is, can this simple process produce complex adaptations like orchids, for example? And even Darwin himself admitted that the process was seemingly implausible. In The Origin of the Species, he states that to suppose the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, for correcting different aberrations in the lens, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I confess, absurd to the highest degree. So that the eye, as this complex adaptation, could have been generated by this process of differential survival and reproductive success, even to Darwin, seemed ridiculous. But I've seen this process occurring, and my favorite example is Canada cat type Shakespeare. And this is my metaphor for generating complexity. So there's a Shakespeare phrase, "Methinks it is like a weasel." And if my cat, who likes to sit on my keyboard, were to walk across the keys, could my cat generate this phrase? Well, if you just imagine only letters in a space, there's 27 characters. The chance of typing each letter correctly is 1 in 27. And so to get all of the letters typed in order, we just multiply 1 in 27 by the number of characters in "Methinks it is like a weasel." And it turns out that the probability of my cat typing this phrase is this very long number, which means that it's very unlikely to happen. But the thing about natural selection is that it's not random. Natural selection allows for selective retention. So when something occurs that is beneficial, a mutation occurs, increases the ability of an organism to compete for the limited food, water, space, etc., it's going to be more successful. It's going to pass on that mutation to its offspring, and we'll see that characteristic be maintained in the population. So if we think about selective retention of this phrase, the first time my cat walked over the keyboard, this is what she typed. If we keep all of the letters that are correct, and do this repeatedly by the 10th time, this is what the phrase looks like. We let her continue walking over the keyboard, locking in letters as they are correctly typed, and on and on, and in fact by the 43rd try she will have produced all of the letters to type this phrase. So natural selection by selective retention can in fact generate complex adaptations. And the key is variation and selective retention. These small changes occur by chance. Selection non-randomly retains the beneficial changes as those increase the survival and reproductive success of the organism. And this complexity emerges step by step. So evolution is essentially a tinkerer. And if you think about the evolution of the eye, it's the story of small beneficial changes occurring step by step. So first we see the evolution of these pigmented cells that sense light or dark. That's all they can do. Light or dark, no, not even shades of gray. It's pretty dangerous to have these cells just on the surface of the skin that can be easily scratched or poked. So over time we see this development of putting these cells in a pocket. Eventually this pocket, through selective retention of gradual changes, becomes this water-filled cavity. And then next we see mutations for enclosing that cavity with a lens and protecting that cavity with a cornea. And then we see a series of several small changes that produce a lens and increase the focusing ability of that lens and produce an iris that can change how much light is allowed into the eye. And so we can see these complex adaptations occurring by very small steps, one on top of another. So let's look at an example of natural selection. This is my favorite, the peppered moth. You can see the white peppered moth in its natural habitat on the left-hand picture next to the black peppered moth. Peppered moths live in England, and originally all of the peppered moths had this white speckled look to them. And it's really good for camouflaging oneself on trees. However, during the Industrial Revolution, the environment changed. There was a lot of factories producing smoke, and the smoke blackened the trunk of the trees. Now all of a sudden, the white moths stood out on the trees, and the lighter you were, the more likely you were to get recognized by birds that like to eat moths. So we have variation in the population, we have competition for survival, and we're going to see selective retention. Some of the moths had more black spots than others. The ones with more black spots were less likely to be spotted by predators. They were more likely to leave offspring. Those offspring inherited the characteristics of greater numbers of black spots, and they had offspring with a variety, some a little lighter, some a little darker. The ones that were a little darker were more likely to survive and not get eaten by predators. Over many generations, we see the peppered moths eventually becoming all black. Now, interestingly, laws about pollution were eventually passed, and the trees were washed free of soot by the rain over many years and became lichen covered again. And we see a reversal of the colors of moths in the peppered moth populations. As the black moths tried to land on the white trees, were more likely to get picked off by predators. Those with a little lighter, a little few more whiter spots were more likely to survive and reproduce. So we can see how, as the environment changed, we're seeing different changes in the direction that this population, the color of this population is occurring in, and we see evolution by natural selection occurring in the population of the peppered moths. Okay, let's talk about the final two forces of evolution before I go over some common misconceptions. We're not going to talk so much about these last two in class, but you should be aware that they are forces of evolution. Gene flow is a force of evolution. Gene flow is just the transfer of genes across population boundaries. So we have population 1, population 2. In generation 1, they're not mating with one another, but then they decide that, hey, that's a nice looking population over there. They exchange mates, and we see that these populations have changed over time. Population 1 now has some purple members. Population 2 now has some marigold members. And the populations themselves have changed over time just because there's been migration between the two as people have moved into, or dots have moved into new areas, mated with individuals there, and changed the characteristics in these populations. Finally, you should be aware that genetic drift is a force of evolution. Genetic drift is random change in allele frequencies over time. So we've been using this word phenotype to talk about characteristics. Evolutionary biologists, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, are really interested in allele frequencies, and alleles are different versions of genes. So there could be a gene for color in these two populations, and you have a purple allele and a marigold allele. It's the same gene. It says what color you should be, but there's two different versions of it that make two different colored individuals. So in this case, we're going to have lightning strike in both populations. Boom! In this case, one of the marigold members has died, and a purple person has replaced her. And in this case, the opposite has occurred, and because it's a random process, it's called drift. It's just that characteristics can change depending on who gets struck by lightning or not. Okay, so let's end the lecture with some common misconceptions. First of all, evolution does not explain the origins of life. It just explains how populations change over time. It doesn't explain where the origins of life came from in the first place. Once you get life, you can get variation in a population, you can get inheritance of this variation, and you can get competition based on different variations of individuals. Evolution by natural selection specifically is not for the good of the species, right? It's all about competition within populations. So species don't show reproductive restraint, for example, to avoid overpopulation. There's this idea that when you see birds flocking in the skies, they're counting their numbers to see if there's too many birds and they should reduce their reproduction. If you look at reproductive restraint, in reality, it's just about individuals being strategic. So there's been a lot of studies done on these bird populations called great tits in the United Kingdom, otherwise known as England to most people. And if you look at the number of eggs laid by birds, most of the eggs being laid are an average number in the middle. You don't see a lot of birds laying very few eggs, and you don't see a lot of birds laying the most eggs. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, the most competitive individuals will leave behind the most offspring. And you're right, the most competitive individuals will leave behind the most offspring. They won't produce the most offspring in the first place. And so we're seeing reproductive restraint because if you have too many babies, you're not able to feed them all, the parents die because they're out foraging constantly and they're getting picked off by predators. However, you're not seeing too few babies because then obviously the genes are not getting represented in future populations. And so the most common number of offspring is actually the most competitive because you're raising the most surviving offspring. And this is a trade-off between having too few and too many babies, and it depends on the environment that you're in. We're going to talk about trade-offs a lot more in this class. Okay, back to evolution. Evolution is not the perfection of form. There's no goal or direction in evolution. There's a lot of trade-offs occurring, and it depends on the changing environment. So individuals are constrained a lot of times in the direction of change. So there's no perfection. Humans are not at the top of the food chain. We're just one of many individuals within our environment. This is my favorite. Natural selection does not give organisms what they need. Obviously, a beaver would love a chainsaw arm. It's constrained by its lack of ability to produce petrol and metal and movable parts that are included in a chainsaw. So again, this goes back to the idea of trade-offs. We don't always see organisms getting what they need. We're seeing organisms get what variation and inheritance and mutation produces. Evolution is also not random. So mutation is random. The changes in the genetic code that randomly pop up and get passed on, that's random. But remember, it's selective retention. It's non-random retention. So the caption here says, the streamlined shape of these yellowfin tuna is no accident. A more streamlined shape allows these fish to move through the water faster. So it's the selective retention of characteristics that increase the speed of the tuna being able to move through the water. Organisms don't try to adapt. So organisms are composites of the characteristics they've inherited from their ancestors. They have no control over the mutations that are occurring in their eggs and sperm and their gametes. They can't see the future and imagine those changes into their genetic codes to pass on to their offspring. So organisms can't try to adapt. They can't try to see the future and increase their reproductive and survival success based on that. Poor beaver. And finally, evolution is not about the survival of the fittest. This is actually quite a misleading term. First of all, because both survival and reproduction are important. If you survive to adulthood, that's great, but if you don't reproduce, your characteristics won't get passed on to the next generation. Survival of the fittest, you have to think about the word fit as being fit to the environment. So it's not about the strongest, it's not about the fastest, it's about the individuals who are most fit to their environment. For example, male bonobos, in that case, sometimes having a smaller brain is more energy efficient. It's more fit to the environment. Sometimes being smaller, more able to hide. Sometimes being slower, you can conserve energy. It's about being fit to the environment. Okay, that's the end of the lecture on evolution. Please get in touch with me if you have any questions or want further explanations.